on the morning of March 14, 1941, engineer Beatric Schilling stood on the rain-swept tarmac at RAF Kendley. She was watching a hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit, preparing for a mission that, statistically, might be his last. Schilling was only 32 years old and had spent 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Yet she had no solution for the deadly engineering flaw that was systematically killing the Royal Air Force's most experienced pilots. That week alone, the Luftwaffe had flown 43 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters across the English Channel. In 27 separate dogfights, the RAF had lost 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires. The combat reports described a grim, repeating pattern. A British pilot would spot an enemy, push his aircraft into a high-speed dive to initiate an attack, and his engine would immediately cut out. The German fighter would either escape entirely, or worse, circle back to put bullets. The German fighter would either escape entirely, or worse, circle back to put bullets through the stalled Hurricane, while the British pilot desperately fought to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Schilling had studied the reports, reviewed the maintenance logs, and interviewed the handful of pilots who had survived these terrifying engine failures. The cause was simple physics with brutal consequences. The carburetor would flood during any negative G maneuver. When a Spitfire or Hurricane suddenly pushed into a steep dive, the fuel would surge violently to the top of the carburetor's float chamber. The engine's jet would effectively be starved, causing the engine to dive for about 1.5 critical seconds. A mere second and a half was more than enough time for a Messerschmitt to close a 300-yard gap and open fire. The Germans did not share this fatal vulnerability. Their Daimler-Benz engines used a completely different, superior direct fuel injection system. With no float chamber to worry about, there was no flooding. Bf-109 pilots could dive, climb, roll, or even invert their aircraft without losing power for a single vital heartbeat. This gave them a decisive advantage in every engagement, a fact both sides knew and the Germans ruthlessly exploited. The Royal Air Force was losing experienced pilots faster than its training schools could replace them, and the war effort was bleeding. Schilling had worked on this problem for 11 months. Rolls-Royce's top engineering teams were already designing a pressure carburetor, which was a proper, complete redesign of the fuel delivery system. But the advanced unit would not be ready until 1943, possibly even 1944. The war would not wait for a perfect solution, and the pilots certainly couldn't. Every morning, young men were climbing into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing that their own aircraft's engine might be the thing that killed them before the Germans ever had the chance. Squadron Leader Davies, 24 years old, 41 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills, walked past Schilling toward his Hurricane. He'd reported engine failure twice in the last month alone, both times during a combat dive. He'd survived only through sheer luck and thousands of hours of training. He gave Schilling a curt nod, and she returned it. He did not know she was the specialist from Farnborough in charge of carburetors. He likely mistook her for someone's secretary. Schilling carried something with her to Kendley that morning. A small, precisely machined brass component, simple almost beyond belief. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had tested it on a bench engine for 6 weeks, and it had worked perfectly. But a laboratory bench test was not the same as combat. Combat was 300 miles per hour, generating negative G-forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death, decided in 1.5 seconds. Schilling walked toward her Norton motorcycle. Inside her leather satchel were 6 of the small brass restrictors, along with a plan that would either save the Royal Air Force's fighter squadrons or immediately end her engineering career at Farnborough. By noon, she would know the outcome. The carburetor problem had first surfaced in July 1940, when the RAF switched to using 100-octane fuel. Higher octane meant more boost, which increased the Merlin engine's output from 1,100 to 1,310 horsepower. The Spitfire Mark II could now hit 370 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch the Messerschmitt 109's. However, the Skinner's Union carburetor simply could not handle the negative G-forces that inevitably came with high-speed combat maneuvering. Schilling understood carburetors better than anyone else at Farnborough. She had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, just 1 month after the declaration of war. She was only 2 women in the entire engine department. The other was a secretary. Schilling, however, was the principal technical officer in charge of carburetor research and development. Most of the men she worked with had never even met a female engineer. Some simply didn't believe women belonged in engineering at all. Schilling did not care what they believed. Her singular focus was on keeping pilots alive. She had been taking apart engines since she was a girl. At 14, she bought her first motorcycle, a Norton, which she immediately stripped down to its individual components. She learned exactly how every part functioned before rebuilding it herself. At 25, she raced that same Norton, averaging 106 miles per hour at Brooklands, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star. She was only the second of 3 women in history to ever earn that coveted award. Racing had taught her precisely how engines failed under intense stress. During high G turns, sudden acceleration, and extreme lean angles. She had learned to feel what an engine needed, instinctively, often before the gauges could even tell her. That unique practical intuition had made her the best carburetor specialist in all of Britain. Now, British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't withstand the stress of air combat. The elegant solution had come to her in January. It was based on simple physics. The float chamber flooded occurred because fuel could flow completely unrestricted when gravity briefly reversed during a dive. So Schilling wondered, what if she restricted that flow? Not completely, but just enough to prevent the flooding, ensuring the engine still received fuel, just not too much. Her design was a simple brass disc with precisely calculated hole in the center. It would be installed in the fuel line right before the carburetor to limit the maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at full throttle. She machined the very first restrictor herself. It was a small, thimble-shaped brass piece, 1/8 of an inch in diameter with a hole of 0.04 of an inch. Those dimensions were critical. If the hole was too large, the carburetor would still flood. If it was too small, the engine would starve for fuel at full power. She tested 17 different sizes before finally finding the perfect balance. She then simplified the design to a flat washer. A flat washer was easier to manufacture in mass quantities, much simpler to install, and easier to replace if it became damaged. Bench tests confirmed it worked, preventing flooding during simulated negative G conditions. But bench tests weren't combat. She desperately needed to test it on an actual aircraft under actual combat conditions. The hurdle was permission. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters violated approximately 40 different regulations. If the restrictor failed in combat and a pilot died, Schilling would be court-martialed, or worse, imprisoned. She decided to skip getting permission and would ask for forgiveness later. That morning at Tenley, she had 6 restrictors in her satchel and one very cooperative ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years and had seen 19 pilots die from engine failures caused by this flaw. He asked no questions when Schilling showed him the small brass washer. He simply nodded and reached for his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad with the pilot inside and the engine warming up, 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked quickly. He disconnected the fuel line running between the pump and the carburetor. The tiny restrictor slid into place. He sealed it with a small butane torch. The entire job took 60 seconds of work. The modification was completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Schilling checked the weld. It was clean, solid, and professional. Squadron Leader Davies was about to fly with the restrictor, and he had no idea it was even there. Schilling hadn't told him, nor had she informed the squadron commander or anyone else, with the sole exception of Sergeant Cooper. If the restrictive failed and Davies was killed, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation, just a dead pilot and a tiny brass washer that should never have been there. The Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies ran through his pre-flight checks. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature good, magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes. The Hurricane rolled forward, gathered speed, and lifted off the ground. Schilling watched it climb, 800 feet, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet. The fighter banked south, heading toward the English Channel. She raised her binoculars and watched Davies climb to 15,000 feet, where 2 more Hurricanes joined him in a standard 3-aircraft patrol section. They flew toward Dungeness, an area where German fighters had been highly active all week. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he would have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it would fail. Schilling and Cooper waited on the tarmac, neither one of them speaking. Ground crew prepared 2 more Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. A fuel truck rumbled past, and mechanics shouted technical jargon across the dispersal area, the normal chaotic sounds of a fighter station at war. Schilling heard none of it. She was mentally calculating fuel flow rates, the 0.04 of an inch diameter, the maximum flow at full throttle, and the 1.5-second duration of -G. The math was sound, but math was not combat. 40 minutes passed, then an hour. There was radio silence from Davies' section. That could mean anything. No contact with enemy fighters, contact too intense to report, or the Davies was dead and his Hurricane was scattered across a French field. At 9:37 a.m., the radio crackled with the controller's voice. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Schilling raised her binoculars. She saw them, 3 dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft. No losses. The Hurricanes entered the circuit, and Davies landed first. He taxied to the dispersal pad, cut the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. Schilling walked toward him, her hands trembling. She had designed bombs and tested engine modifications under laboratory conditions many times before, but she had never done anything like this, installing an unauthorized modification and sending a pilot into combat to test it. Davies pulled off his helmet, and he was smiling. That was extremely unusual. Pilots rarely smiled after a combat patrol. They usually looked exhausted or even haunted. Davies looked excited. Cooper was the one who asked the question. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then at Schilling, then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlin ever run," he said. He had dove on 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness, and his engine never missed a beat. Schilling asked Davies to describe the encounter in detail. He had spotted 2 Messerschmitt 109's at 14,000 feet, both flying east toward France. Davies positioned his section above the enemy, securing the altitude advantage, and pushed into a steep dive, reaching 400 miles per hour. He experienced the -G forces strong enough to pull him up against his harness straps. It was the kind of dive that should have killed his engine. But the Merlin kept running at full power through the entire dive. Davies closed the distance to 200 yards before the German pilot even saw him. He fired a 3-second burst, saw strikes on the left Messerschmitt's wing root, and the German fighter immediately broke hard right and fled toward France. Davies then pulled up and climbed back to altitude. The engine had performed flawlessly. It was the first time since 11 months that Davies had successfully pressed a diving attack without his engine cutting out. He immediately wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Schilling told him. She explained the restrictor, the simple brass washer, and the fuel flow limitation. Davies stared at her in silence for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Cooper and issued an order. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station, today," he said. Schilling tried to explain that the modification was not authorized. Davies didn't care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kendley had lost friends to this engine failure. 19 pilots had died in 6 months. Davy said if the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron desperately needed working engines. Cooper installed the restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that same afternoon. Schilling had brought 6 total. She kept 1 for further testing. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with the restrictors installed. There were 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks were successfully pressed against German fighters. The pilots reported that the Merlin engines ran perfectly, better than perfectly. Some pilots even claimed they were getting more power at high altitude. Word spread like wildfire. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the restrictor. They all wanted it, immediately. Schilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days. Could she travel to their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? How quickly could they be manufactured? The next problem was supply. Schilling had machined only 6 restrictors herself in the RAE workshop. Manufacturing thousands of them would require proper production facilities, brass stock, precision machining equipment, and stringent quality control. She knew that if the restrictor was slightly out of tolerance, it could be fatal for the pilot. She flew to Rolls-Royce's main engine factory at Derby and presented her design. The head of production looked at the brass washer, then at the technical officer, and said, "It can't possibly work. If it worked, Rolls-Royce would have found the solution months ago." Schilling simply placed her flight test reports on his desk. They detailed the 0 engine failures, the 12 successful attacks, and squadron leader Davy's testimonial. Rolls-Royce immediately put the restrictor into production. They manufactured the first run of 1,000 restrictors in a single week. Schilling, who was still officially unauthorized to modify operational aircraft, became the central figure in the installation process. She was the only person with the deep practical knowledge of the device. She organized the production, coordinated logistics, and personally trained the ground crews. She would drive her Norton motorcycle from one RAF station to the next. The ground crews called her Miss Schilling's Orifice. The nickname was a crude double entendre, but it was also a sign of deep professional respect. They were happy to see her as she was the woman who was saving their pilots' lives. By March 25th, installation teams were fully prepared. 600 restrictors had been manufactured, 40 stations were on the schedule, and 3,000 Merlin engines were waiting for the modification. Schilling started her Norton and headed north toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill was the busiest fighter station in 11 Group, operating 32 Spitfires and 21 Hurricanes with 4 squadrons rotating through continuous combat. Schilling arrived at 8 a.m. on March 26th. Group Captain Grace, the station commander, met her at the gate. He had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the past 2 months alone and ordered the restrictors installed immediately. The ground crews worked in shifts, modifying 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line, weld the restrictor into place, and reconnect the line, test for leaks. The welding was crucial. A faulty weld at altitude could starve the engine entirely. Schilling supervised every installation personally, checking the weld on every single aircraft. She did not leave until every single operational fighter at Biggin Hill had the restrictor installed. Then she drove to the next station. Within days, every pilot in Fighter Command knew about Miss Schilling's Orifice. Pilots requested it specifically, and some refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had the modification. Squadron commanders supported them, having seen too many good pilots die from preventable engine failures. German intelligence soon noticed the sudden dramatic change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April mentioned greatly improved RAF diving attacks. British fighters were no longer breaking off pursuit during negative G maneuvers, and the Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the known carburetor weakness.
The tactical advantage had vanished. By mid-April, Schilling's team had installed the restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines. This included every Hurricane and Spitfire in fighter command, every operational training unit, and every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off the production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton had the restrictors pre-installed. The Rolls-Royce pressure carburetor was still in development, with an estimated readiness date of 1943. However, the restrictor worked so well that some engineers began to question if the pressure carburetor was even necessary. Why completely redesign the entire fuel system when a 50-cent brass washer solved the problem? The impact on the air war was immediate and undeniable. In March 1941, the RAF lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires in combat, while shooting down 61 German aircraft, a ratio of 1.3 to 1, barely breaking even. April was a different story entirely. The RAF lost 29 British fighters, but destroyed 94 German aircraft, a ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor was not the only factor, but squadron commanders universally credited it as a major contributor to this massive swing. Pilots reported a surge in confidence in combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, who flew Spitfires out of Duxford, had experienced engine failure 4 times before the restrictor's installation. Afterward, he pressed diving attacks without the slightest hesitation. He destroyed 3 Messerschmitt 110's in May and 2 more in June, crediting the restrictor with giving him the confidence to commit at those aggressive tactics.
The modification quickly spread beyond fighter command. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their Beaufighters, and Bomber Command wanted them for their training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm inquired about installing them on their carrier-based fighters. Schilling coordinated the large-scale production with Rolls-Royce, and by June, they were manufacturing 1,000 restrictors per week. The restrictor remained in service until the very end of the war. After the war concluded, aviation schools taught the story of the restrictor as a prime example of elegant problem-solving under extreme pressure. It represented a simple solution, immediate implementation, and measurable results. Everything good engineering should strive to be. Keith Maddock, the chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, later stated, "Beatrice Schilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. The restrictor was a war-winning modification." Schilling's work did not stop with the restrictor. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had dozens of other critical problems that urgently needed solutions. Engine failures at high altitude, fuel system icing in extreme cold, and starting problems in Arctic conditions. Every single problem threatened pilot lives, and every single problem landed on Schilling's desk. She worked on cold weather modifications for Spitfires deployed to Murmansk. In the Russian winter, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard engine oil turned to sludge. Batteries died, and fuel lines froze. British pilots couldn't even start their aircraft, and Soviet ground crews had no experience with the Merlin engines. Schilling developed a specialized cold start procedure using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures, which proved to be successful. After the war concluded, she continued her career at the RAE. She always kept her engineering and marriage in separate compartments. She also continued racing motorcycles whenever time permitted. She had stopped racing at Brooklands when the war began, as the famous circuit was converted to aircraft production facilities, but she still rode her beloved Norton. Fast riding, she often said, helped her think and solve problems that laboratory work alone couldn't crack. Some of her best engineering ideas came to her while riding at 90 miles per hour on quiet country roads. By 1945, she had worked on 17 major projects at Farnborough. This included cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, fuel mixture optimization, and supercharger efficiency upgrades. Each one of these projects saved lives. Each one kept RAF aircraft operational under extreme conditions. But none ever achieved the enduring fame of the humble restrictor. The war ended in May 1945 with the German surrender. the Royal Aircraft Establishment transitioned from wartime emergency projects to peacetime research. A slower pace, lower urgency, and very different priorities. Schilling stayed at Farnborough with no intention of leaving. Engineering was, quite simply, her life. In 1948, she received official recognition for her extraordinary wartime contributions. She received an OBE, the Order of the British Empire. Her career continued for another 2 decades. She worked on high-altitude research, investigating how a rocket engine could save a pilot whose fighter had been damaged in a dogfight. She even helped design a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team, a strange project for an aeronautical engineer. Yet bobsled design involved aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management, all skills Schilling had mastered over 30 years. The RAF team used her design in competition. They didn't win any medals, but they didn't crash either. The restrictor itself became a permanent teaching example. Engineering schools all over the world studied it, a simple solution to a complex problem, implemented immediately under wartime pressure, with measurable, life-saving results. It was everything good engineering should strive to be. Some universities now keep original restrictors on display. They are small brass washers in museum cases, reminders that the most elegant solutions do not require complexity. If this forgotten story of genius and heroism moved you the way it moved us, please hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about engineers who saved lives with brass washers and brilliant thinking. Real people, real heroism.